the greater relationship there is between Iran militarily and Russia militarily. And then we're seeing components coming in from China, and we're seeing North Korea getting in. This coming together is of greater global danger, and that's why I think there's going to be action taken now to try and indicate to those in those different countries that this might not be the best move for them.
So, a senior Ukrainian official has called on Western partners to allow weapons that they've supplied to be used to strike military warehouses inside Russia, as there's suspicions about about Iran providing ballistic missiles for Russia's war effort in Ukraine. Iran denies these claims. So, what is Ukraine suggesting here?
Well, Ukraine's been asking for quite some time to get permission to use Western-supplied long-range weapons against military targets inside Russia. The United States has been restricting that use, as has Germany, and that restricts the use of weapons that will contain components or require access to United States systems to target into those targets in Russia. So, for example, the UK Storm Shadow or the French Scalp missile will require access to US military-grade GPS. It's different to the GPS we've got in our cars, and therefore a US restriction will also restrict the use of those. However, today we've just had the US Secretary of State in London with the UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy, and Antony Blinken has confirmed that US intelligence has identified that about 200 short-range Iranian ballistic missiles, the FATH 360 missile, which has got a maximum range of about 120 kilometers, 75 miles, and contains a 150 kilogram warhead. About 200 of those have been supplied by Iran to Russia and are in Russia at the moment. And he said that he believes the Russians will be able to use those within the next couple of weeks. That's significant, and that significant change in what has been supplied to Russia has resulted in Antony Blinken with David Lammy hopping on a transport to get themselves to Kyiv in the next day. And they're going to announce on Friday what their decision is going to be. I suspect that decision is an authorization under limited circumstances to use Western-supplied long-range weapons against targets in Russia.
So let's talk about that decision a little bit later on. But for now, in terms of the capacity of these short-range missiles that Iran's provided Russia with, what impact will this have on Russia's efforts in the war in Ukraine and also in turn for Ukraine?
It'll not have a massive impact. Now, 200 missiles with 150 kilogram warheads that's a lot of capability that could be fired. But the reason why I say that is these missiles they're relatively short range, about 75 miles. They're almost an adaptation of the S-300 anti-air missile, but they've been designed for ground-to-ground use. They're launched from a launch tube, and it's usually in a configuration of 2 tubes together, 3, 4, or 6, so they can have an equivalent ripple effect on the battlefield. But what it'll allow the Russians to do is to free up some of their longer range ballistic missiles that they have been using against short range targets to attack further into Ukraine. And we've seen them, when they've done that, attack civilian targets, whether that be civilian infrastructure, critical national infrastructure, or in many cases civilian accommodation blocks and retail centers and the like, killing civilians. So this is it's a significant change from a political perspective, because we're getting that growing relationship coming out between Iran and Russia, and these are weapons beyond the Shahad 136. There have been warnings put into Iran for months and months and months from the West, and they've stepped over the line with these. And I think that's why this is a political sea change and politically significant. It's not necessarily going to be that significant on the battlefield itself.
Iran, they did start supplying Russia with drones in 2022, didn't they? In terms of these missiles, why do you think that potentially, as you suggested, there could be a decision made where under strict regulation, Ukraine will be able to potentially use these supplies from Western allies. Why do you think that the West has had this response? And do we also see any further response from the West on this?
Well, I'll start with the latter. Yes, there's going to be further response from the West. There's going to be further sanctions put against Iran, and Secretary Blinken specifically said Iran Air. So we'll see restrictions in the Iranian national carrier being used. And he also said these were sanctions that were going to be put in by the United States, but he expected his allies to bring their own measures in due course, and therefore we'll see a set of sanctions coming in from a lot of other different nations. And there will be further economic sanctions. This is in violation of a number of different United Nations Security Council resolutions. Now, the supply of the Shahed 136 drones, you could argue, was as well. The Iranians have helped the Russians build a factory inside Russia for these and help train them on how to use them and how to build them. But moving up to the ballistic missile level is one step further. So you can put red lines out there. And I think when the Shahed 136 drones came in, there hadn't actually been a red line drawn. Since then, there has been a red line drawn. And unlike Vladimir Putin, who every time a red line is crossed, he just seems to forget about it, I think Antony Blinken has been very clear. And I suspect the United States are going to take quite hard measures, which will favor the Ukrainians because it'll give the Ukrainians what they've been asking for and what they deserve for a long, long time. That's the ability to use Western supplied weapons against military targets inside Russia and attack these missiles at the places where they're likely to be fired from.
What does this show about the relationship between Russia and Iran? Are we seeing a further growing towards each other in terms of not just allies, but military allies as well?
We're seeing an increasing relationship between Russia and Iran. And interestingly, Antony Blinken also brought into the same conversation both Russia and North Korea. And this is something we've been talking about for a while now, this link between these four different nations. And interestingly, there are four different nations that operate similar military capabilities. They've got leaders who are in place for many, many years. In fact, for life, as long as they want. They can think in generational terms, not in presidential or prime ministerial terms of office. And for them to start to come together and cooperate more on a military basis is a significant threat to global stability. And this is something that will be weighing heavily on Antony Blinken's mind as he looks at what's going on around the rest of the world. Of course, Russia is starting very large joint exercises with China, naval exercises with China. At the minute, we've got the Chinese aggression against Taiwan in Southeast Asia, the Chinese aggression against Philippine Coast Guard, and aggressions around the Paracel and the Spratly Islands. So, and we've got links then with Iran across the instability that's happening across the Middle East. So the worst case scenario for everything is this starts to join up. And actually, the greater relationship there is between Iran militarily and Russia militarily, and then we're seeing components coming in from China, and we're seeing North Korea getting in. This coming together is of greater global danger, and that's why I think there's going to be action taken now to try and indicate to those in those different countries that this might not be the best move for them.
And how do you think that we do see the West responding to this? I mean, in terms of ideology, these four nations can be quite distinct in many parts. How big a threat do you think that they pose to the West in terms of this strength of unity between them?
Yes, ideologically, they're very different. The Russians and the Chinese have never been good bedfellows. Kim Jong-un in North Korea, I think, will want to build a relationship up with anyone. He's closest to China, but he's become increasingly close to Russia over a significant number of years. And he's also supplied into Iran. Iran is looking for friends anywhere. We're also seeing an economic coming together under the BRICS arrangement. So you've got Brazil and South Africa and China and Russia, all coming, and that's a growing economic organization. So diplomatically, these countries are not good bedfellows, but situationally, with what's going on around the world, I think it suits them to be able to come together in a more cooperative way, both militarily and economically, and put that pressure on the West. And it really is putting pressure on the West and putting pressure on Western institutions and organizations, because their coherent approach is not helping the EU. It's not helping a lot of the international organizations that the US and other countries are part of, and that's seen as a direct economic as well as military threat. So that's why I think the Americans are monitoring very closely. On one hand, they're reluctant to allow things to escalate because it could cause greater frictions elsewhere. But on the other hand, once a red line has been crossed, they have to do something to send a clear message out to those that want to use military capability and force to try and better themselves that this is not a good option.
Economically, China is quite dependent on the West for exports. How do you think that this decision for Iran to send these missiles to Russia and, with this potential threat of sanctions to Iran, do you think that that's going to have any implications on China and Russia's relationship?
Not at the moment, and we're seeing a bettering of the Chinese-Russian relationship, but I think that's an economic bettering. I think what we're seeing is the supply of components, dual-use components, electronic components from China into Russia under various guises. But the price that Russia is paying for that is not something that we're seeing out publicly. China will be getting favorable rates on Russian oil and Russian oil products. China is also probably getting access to Russian critical national infrastructure and Russian natural resources, almost to the point I'd say that they will be following similar business models to what they've done throughout Africa and are trying to do throughout South America, in that for providing that level of support, they will have a degree of ownership over where these assets are. And therefore, China is looking after itself. Xi Jinping is very canny, but everything that he does is 100% in China's interest first and foremost. And he will be balancing off how much he can get away with to gain interest in assets throughout Russia that he wants to get interest in, but without upsetting the West so much that will tip the balance away from his required economic relationships that he has with the West, and he'll be watching that very closely indeed. However, he's also watching to see what our military response is, and if he thinks that the West is going to give in to Russia in any way, shape, or form with regard to Ukraine, then Xi Jinping will make a measured decision as to whether he then decides to bring Taiwan back under the Chinese fold completely by force, or he continues to wait and try and do it diplomatically.
If a decision is made by Western allies to allow Ukraine to use these weapons within whatever terms that they provide, how do we see Putin reacting to this?
Well, Putin has already said through Lavrov and Peskov and other individuals who've been sent comments out that if the West does allow this, then that's another red line, and Russia will threaten nuclear responses potentially and threaten other responses. It's only another piece of rhetoric that falls into line with all of the other bits of rhetoric. There was red lines put in for the supply of F-16s. Well, they've got in and nothing's happened. Red lines put in about activity on Russian soil. Well, that's been crossed. Ukraine's in Kursk, the Kursk region, and nothing's happened. There have been red lines crossed when the West supplied tanks. Well, that red line was crossed and nothing's happened. And you can repeat this time after time after time. So there's a lot of rhetoric coming out of Russia. The interesting thing, I think, is with Vladimir Putin having to go out to Iran, North Korea, and others, it's showing just how short he is within his own domestic defense manufacturing capability and defense industrial base, because he's having to go out elsewhere and he can't keep up with the expenditure. He's only got a finite time left of being able to carry out the activities that he's doing. Now, that finite time could be measured in over a year, if not a couple of years, but there is a finite time. He's suffering at the moment.